F1 racing got worse in 2023, partly because of some development loopholes that were missed and probably won't be addressed for several years. The dominance of Max Verstappen and Red Bull was the main talking point whenever anyone discussed how entertaining F1 was this season, but another factor was also a constant issue. Behind the runaway champion and winner of an astonishing 19 of the 22 races, the field did actually seem to get closer this year. But as for how well these closely matched cars could race, well, it turned out to be bad news. When F1 and the FIA were working on the new ground effect aero rules, the big numbers trotted out were to do with the downforce a car lost when running in the wake of another. The previous generation of cars apparently lost close to 50% of downforce when one car length behind another because of the so-called dirty air. When the new rules came in for 2022, the expectation was that cars would lose just 15% at the same distance. And when running around 3 car lengths behind, that number should have dropped to 5%. These were only ever estimates, and the suggestion was F1 got pretty close in 2022 to around 20% of downforce lost at 1 car length behind. As teams developed, they were always going to find ways to produce downforce that meddled with the cleaner wake the regulations aimed to achieve, and the problem got even worse than was feared in 2023. Earlier this year, it was revealed that the cars are now losing 35% of their downforce, a quite considerably worse return. And it has been admitted by the rule makers that this is partly because the regulations allowed for certain things to be exploited that the FIA had not accounted for. Nicholas Tombazis, director of the FIA's single-seater department, revealed there were some loopholes that we didn't manage to close soon enough. He cited the front wing end plate area and some furniture like the brake ducts inside the front wheels as places where teams have been able to develop in ways that have interfered with the airflow and the wake off the rear of the car. Ultimately, a 35% downforce loss is still a reasonable amount better than 2021, but it's still a deterioration, and the theory is it has combined badly with another big F1 problem. Several drivers have complained more about thermal degradation from the tyres this season, and Tombazis says the two are linked. A worse wake costs downforce and makes the following car slide around, which we know the Pirelli tyres struggle to handle. At the same time, a worse wake means less cool air for the car behind to pass through, which will be cooling the tyres a little less. Managing that degradation can kill racing. One of the reasons the Las Vegas Grand Prix was so good is that low temperatures and track grip meant that thermal degradation was just not a limiting factor in the way it normally is. This joint issue is something that the FIA has explicitly stated needs to be improved. Theoretically, the FIA could take pretty swift action to rectify this. It has the ability under the regulations to outlaw designs that go against the objective of the rules, chiefly the desire to reduce the turbulent airflow wake. You could call this a spirit of the regulations regulation, and it's the FIA's main weapon in preserving the intention of this set of aero rules. The technical regulations state the objective is to enable the cars to race closely by ensuring the aerodynamic performance loss of a car following another is kept to a minimum. That means that a design can be perfectly legal, but with the rules and governance in place, the FIA can throw it out. And this ability has already been used to take designs that are legal under the rules and outlaw them for the following season. Perhaps the most famous example is the Aston Martin rear wing end plate geometry introduced at last year's Hungarian Grand Prix. One of the key decisions for this rule set was to simplify the edges of the rear wing to avoid the creation of vortices that contribute to the turbulence behind the car. As we could see on the original F1 show car, the aim was to have the main plane of the rear wing effectively bleed into the vertical support with a simple transition. Effectively, end plates were banned. But you can't keep a good idea down, and Aston Martin worked out that with a clever reading of the various regulations governing the radiuses and curvature in this area, it could create a kind of end plate. The FIA initially only reluctantly approved the design, hence it was always likely it would be outlawed for 2023, and as you can see from the 2023 Aston Martin, it's no longer possible to produce this kind of design. Another less successful example of such a rule change is the front wing end plate design pioneered by Mercedes last year. This created a cutout in the lower part of the end plate to encourage the dreaded aerodynamic outwash around the front tyre. So much of what the FIA has tried to do with these regulations is aimed at preventing outwash, as it's one of the aero traits that has the biggest detrimental effect on the car behind. The rules were changed to make the positioning and orientation of the connections between the front wing flaps and the end plate more tightly regulated. That meant last year's heavily swept forward design couldn't be produced this year. However, Mercedes recreated this effect by slightly narrowing the wing flaps and using tiny stays to attach them to the end plate. That was once again completely legal and still created the cutout for outwash. And at the moment, despite the concerns about how much harder it is for cars to follow, it doesn't look like the FIA is planning any imminent crackdown. It would be wrong to say that the FIA has just sat on its hands and let teams destroy the spirit of the 2022 rules, because it has clearly intervened more than once already. But there doesn't seem to be an intent to act further for 2024 or even 2025. That's slightly surprising given the circumstances, but Tombazis says there are no intentions to make changes before the next set of car rules in 2026 unless anything unpredictable happens. This would appear to go against what was hinted at earlier in the year when the FIA first acknowledged how much worse the dirty air effect had got in 2023. We had pretty low expectations for what might be possible in 25, which is when Tombazis had previously indicated some small detailed changes might be implemented. It could have been similar to the rule tweaks made in 2019, the most obvious of which were to the front wings, which was simplified to chip away at the outwash. This helped manage the problem for the final years before the major rules overhaul came in. So if the current problem has got worse and the FIA has a means to take action and it claims to know the areas that need to improve, why not do something similar now? Reading between the lines, it seems that the FIA doesn't view it as necessary. To actually improve the situation, the changes needed are almost certainly too big to be worth pushing through for 2025. Really, the FIA's interference is meant to be reserved for relatively minor adjustments. It would take a big problem to develop to justify larger changes at short notice. And there seems to be a belief that there are no other loopholes for teams to exploit in the most sensitive areas. Although given how often the teams outsmart the rule makers with these things, that feels like a declaration that could come back to bite the FIA when the new cars break cover next year. Tombazis reckons there has not been a deterioration through the current season and is confident things will not get much worse in 2024. That's a key difference to the 2019 change we mentioned when a problem desperately needed containing. Plus, as we mentioned previously, any aero changes to improve the quality of the racing also need to be supported by better quality tyres. Now it's been decided to kill the planned tyre blanket ban for 2025, Pirelli has a bit more scope to focus its development work on better thermal degradation. That might mean a decent, important step for 2025 already, which would be twinned with bigger aero changes and lighter cars for 26. All of that probably makes it easier for the FIA to stomach not doing anything right now. But teams will keep developing their cars and that will result in adding more downforce. Exactly how they'll do that and whether it makes the car's weight characteristics even worse is something the FIA will only find out in time. And it certainly would not be at all surprising if following continued to get worse next year and in 2025. If we're really going to be waiting until 2026 for the FIA to enforce more robust regulations to get things back to what the 2022 rules intended, should we be worried for the intervening years? Well, that depends a great deal on how competitive those seasons turn out to be. As we outlined earlier, the dirty air effect was painfully bad in 2021, but a close title battle means that will go down in history as a classic season, despite overtaking being more difficult than it has been for the last 2 years. Looking ahead to the next 2 years before F1's next major rules reset, we've just had a big warning of how bad things could get. We're not saying the Abu Dhabi finale was a terrible race. By Abu Dhabi standards, it was fine. There was some overtaking, a bit of strategic variety, and we had a bit of championship positions intrigue. Given the Verstappen Red Bull domination, the only real intrigue this season has been localised to each Grand Prix, and frankly, you know Abu Dhabi isn't going to be a thriller. But this isn't meant to be an attack on the track that hosts F1's finale every year. Really, the lack of spectacle was a reflection of the season that preceded it. It's a warning to F1. TV ratings were down for the second year running in 2023. If the calendar keeps expanding, the sporting spectacle needs to be worth tuning into 24 times a year. That's why it's worrying to hear that efforts to make racing better with the new rules have deteriorated so much in the second year and that it's unlikely to be rectified until 2026 at the earliest.